glad she stopped. I was going to start crying. Thanks, Anna. I'm just going to dive in. I'm going to tell stories. And a famous leader of ours a couple thousand years ago used to teach by stories. So if you have to try to figure out what the point is, they were always trying to figure out what his point was also 2,000 years ago. So I love to fish, as she said. We didn't plan that part. I love to fly fish. And so I was out fly fishing in western Colorado last summer, and with a friend of mine who owns this small ranch, and he has these fishing ponds, so it's kind of cheating fishing. You know, you throw the fly out there, and a trout gets it, and then you reel it in. So we were doing that for a couple hours, and he goes, "Do you want to meet my neighbor?" And I said, "Sure, I like neighbors. I'll be happy to meet your neighbor." And I said, "Well, who is it?" He says, "Joe Cocker." And I said, "Joe Cocker, the rocker, like the famous rocker Joe Cocker?" And he goes, "Yeah, now you guys don't know Joe Cocker because you're probably too young, but he, you know the raspy voice, you know the song, 'You Are So Beautiful'? You are so," anyway, I don't want to sing it, but anyway, everybody here that's my age and up knows Joe Cocker. He was a headliner at Woodstock back in the 60s, 70s. He's still alive, and he happens to be my friend's neighbor at this ranch in Colorado. I mean, who knew? So he's like 65 years old. We're in my friend Steve's pickup truck driving down this gravel road to Joe's ranch, and Steve started to lecture me. He's like, "Carl, now listen, Joe Cocker's an atheist. He doesn't believe in God or Jesus or any of that, you know, so I've been his neighbor for 16 years. I try to respect him. He's famous. You know, you have to be kind of nice when you're talking to famous people. I usually don't introduce people to him, but I think he'd like you, so I called him, and he said, yeah, bring him on down for 5 minutes. He's, recording a new album, but he'll give you 5 minutes and just say hi. But don't talk, don't do any of that. Don't talk about Christianity." He said, "I've been trying to witness to Joe for 16 years, and he doesn't want any of that stuff." And I said, "Steve, I don't ever talk about Christianity." And he goes, yeah, I know your gig. You just talk about Jesus, not Christianity. Don't talk about Christianity or Jesus, either one. I said, "Well, I'll try, but I mean, it could be hard." He said, "No, just don't do it, please. Just honor me." And so I said, "Okay, I mean, that's fair enough. If you're introducing somebody to your famous friend, you want to honor that friendship. So I'll try to be good." So we get into Joe's house. He has this big, he actually transported an English castle from England, where he is home, to the mountains of Colorado, literally. I mean, he transported a castle stone by stone and rebuilt it in Colorado. So we go in the house, and he's making himself a green thing shake, and he's, the first thing he says to me he goes, I've been dry for eight years now. Now I drink these blankety blank things. And I go, "Great," but he looked like he'd been drunk for like 50 years straight. I mean, he really did. He looked really, really bad. And so he looked at me, and of course, the obvious question to ask somebody when you first meet him, is you'll learn this later. Now it's, what school do you go to? Once you get older and you get jobs, you say, "What do you do?" Like, what do you do for a living? So he said to me, "What do you do?" And I looked at my friend Steve, and he was like, and I said, "I do Middle East stuff," and I was trying to think, how do I say what I do without mentioning Jesus? This is different. This is weird to be thinking I'm trying to not mention Jesus. This is a new one. And I said, "I stuff in the Middle East." And he goes, "Like, what kind of stuff?" I go, "Well, I mean, I do reconciliation meetings between Israelis and Palestinians, and kind of peacekeeping things between members of the U.S. Congress and the Arab League and the Arab world. And I mean, it's kind of interesting stuff." And he's like, "What the blank?" I mean, he has a really bad, he's rock stars like have some kind of a special vocabulary. Like every third word has to be a bad word. So, I mean, seriously. And so he goes, "Well, how do you do that?" And I looked at my friend Steve. He's like, and I'm thinking, okay, how do I do that without mentioning Jesus? So I go, how do I do that? And now, Steve had told me that Joe Cocker is like he's not just a non-believer, but he's like a hardened atheist, and he's been trying so hard, every angle, to witness to this guy. It hasn't worked. And so now he's asking me, how do I do that? So I go, well, we have these principles that we work around, that we feel like Israelis and Palestinians and Americans and Arabs and everybody kind of agrees on these set of principles. And he goes, he has this green shake thing, and he slams it and goes, "Well, blankety blank, tell me what these things are. Why are you being so weird?" And I finally just said, I go, "Well, he told me not to say Jesus." And it was like built up in me. I had to say the word, I said, but the answer is, we were talking about Jesus. He goes, "Oh, no, not this Christian stuff again." I go, no, it's not Christian stuff. I said, "I don't know if you know, Joe, but Jesus wasn't a Christian." We forget that, right? Actually, Jesus wasn't a Christian. That's kind of a funny thing to think of, isn't it? I mean, it sounds kind of weird, but he was Jewish. And there was no religion called Christianity in the time of Christ. And Christ didn't come to start a religion. And so I said that to him, and he goes, this is blankety blank interesting. He said, come on in here. Come on in here. So we sat down, and we talked about Jesus for 2.5 hours. At the end of the time, he goes, now, we hadn't even got to the point. He said, what is it that you use exactly? You said you use some principles. And I said, well, actually, I was just trying to not say Jesus, but we actually go through the Sermon on the Mount. That's Matthew 5, 6, and 7. He goes, he said, that's the Bible, right? I go, yeah, it's part of the Bible. And he goes, and what do you do with that? I said, well, actually, we just read it. It takes 22 minutes. If you just read it in a normal reading voice, it takes 22 minutes to read the Sermon on the Mount. He goes, we should do that right now. He goes, I think I have one of those Bibles somewhere. And he yells, he goes, hey, Martha. And his butler lady or whatever, I don't know, comes out. And he goes, don't we have one of those Bible things around here somewhere? She's like, yes, Mr. Cocker. And she's English. And so she disappears and she comes back out with this big family Bible that's like this big. And I'm not kidding. She was literally going like this. She was going, and blowing the dust off. She sets it down. And he's like, well, where is that blankety blank? And I open it up. I've never heard so many blankety blanks next to the word Bible and Jesus. And so he opens it up, and we find Matthew 5, and we read straight through Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Now, just carrying on the rocker theme, somebody that relate to you guys a little bit more. Last summer, I was with Marcus Mumford, who's the leader of Mumford & Sons band. You may have heard of them. And we've known the Mumford for 15 years, since Marcus Mumford was like 10 years old, because we go to England a lot, and I've spoken at his dad's church many times. And so we were actually trap shooting. You guys know what trap shooting? Where you shoot those little clay pigeon things with shotguns. So he loves to shoot things. And so we went out to this place where we go trap shooting last summer. And he was saying, he said, Carl, I know this is your deal. He said 2 of the members of our band are they call themselves atheists, but he goes, I think they're agnostic, which is often the case. I mean, people often are just kind of, I'm not sure what's out there or what's going on, but only a few people are actual atheists. By the way, good on you guys for inviting a real live one of them into your midst last night. Having Chris Stedman here, I think, is a huge, I'm sure it was controversial. I actually don't know, but I think that's like the coolest thing that I've ever heard you guys doing. Because what we usually do is we talk about them, but without ever actually meeting them. And so one of them was actually here. You actually got to talk to them. Imagine that. Instead of talking about what those people believe, actually talk to one of those people and actually find out what they actually believe. You should be more excited about that than that. You're like, well, I don't know. We had an atheist in our building. Well, good for you. Good for you. When you talk about Muslims, don't just talk about Muslims. Bring a real live actual Muslim to talk to. It's amazing when you talk to the actual person rather than talking about the idea of the person, the caricature of the person. Because the caricatures of the persons are easy to shoot down. It's easy to give Muslims a hard time when you don't know one. It's easy to make fun of atheists when you don't know any. It's easy to give gay people a hard time when you don't actually have any gay friends. So good for you for doing that. I'm serious. I was so impressed by that. Anyway, back to Marcus Mumford. So we're out shooting trap, these clay pigeon things, and he asked me about his 2 friends. And I said, well, what do you think? What do you think I would say about your 2 band members who say they're atheists? What do you think the key is? And he goes, well, I think you would say the key is Jesus. And I said, I would say that. And the key, though, is what do you mean by Jesus? Usually when we say the answer is Jesus, because it fits on a bumper sticker, the answer is Jesus, or Jesus is the answer, what we mean by that actually is someone very religious and very Christian-y and very theological. But what if the answer is actually just Jesus himself? I love Paul, where Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2:2, I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except for Jesus and him crucified. Nothing else. Now, Paul knew a lot of else stuff to not know anything about. I like that sentence. But he chose to not know anything else, including all of his theological training. He was the most trained theologian of the day, probably the best Christian theologian, I suppose, of all time, right? The Apostle Paul. But he chose to know none of that compared to knowing Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior, according to Philippians chapter 3. But in 1 Corinthians 2:2, he just said, I resolved to know nothing else but Jesus. And so I asked Marcus, I said, honestly, what if you just talked to the guys about Jesus? He goes, maybe that's it. So anyway, the next time we were at the concert they were doing there at Red Rocks in Colorado, and so we were backstage with the band and stuff. And so he introduced me to these the 2 of the members, the guy that strums the thing. What's that thing called? Is that cello, or I don't know, with that big bass thingy. And then the guy that plays the piano and keyboard. And And one of those two grew up in a Christian home, like Marcus did, but they're all kind of confused and searching for faith, and and they're trying to live in the rock star world and winning Grammys and all this stuff, but still trying to figure out what it means to follow Jesus. And they're basically just confused, like so many people are. They're just confused. Is it the Christendom of my parents? Is it a religion that we're believing in? Is it going to church every Sunday? Is it going to a Christian college? Is it believing the right doctrines in the Bible? Is it reading your Bible, having a quiet time every day? What does it mean to follow Jesus? What does it mean to believe? I mean, there's actual, and I think they're legitimate questions. And I think we shouldn't be afraid to ask real questions. You shouldn't be afraid to ask and wrestle with real questions. And if the community that you're in doesn't allow you to do that, actually, I don't know where that's going, so never mind with that. I was going to say change communities. I think I'll say that, change communities. If the community doesn't ask you to ask real questions, you're in the wrong community. Now, I think this school does allow you and even encourage you to ask real questions. But if you feel like people are pressuring you to believe the thing that you're supposed to believe, you don't have to play along with that. Life is real. I mean, things happen, and you should wrestle. You should wrestle with faith. Doubting is not the opposite of faith. The opposite of faith is fear. So if you're afraid to doubt, that's the opposite of faith. Having doubts about God, having doubts about your faith, not having an atheist because it might make somebody doubt, that's weird. That's not real life. You should feel free. Christ gave, I love Galatians 5:1. It says, Paul says, it's for freedom that Christ has set you free. You've been free to be free. Now, it doesn't mean you're free to do whatever you want, because actually that's not freedom. Real freedom is only found in Jesus Christ. Real, actual freedom is internal. It's not just, hey, I can do whatever I want. It's not a bad attitude. That's not freedom. Don't mistake bad attitudes for freedom. So when Marcus said Jesus, and I agree with him, we actually sat with those guys that night, and I talked to them about Jesus for about an hour before their concert. And you know what two of these guys said? And one of their dads is a pastor. He said, we've never heard this before. What did I tell them? Actually, we just went through the Gospels. Now, I just didn't present the gospel the way we do it in the Western world, which is a 30-minute presentation, with all that thing. I talked about the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I kind of gave a summary of the life of Christ. Now, the ultimate good news is the death and resurrection, but that's not all the good news. The good news is also the life of Jesus. Boulder, Colorado Boulder is a little bit different than Upland. And not that much different, but it's a little bit different. And Boulder is kind of a liberal college town, kind of a classic college town. So I had this crazy idea a couple years ago, go with a friend named Jay Pathick, and just kind of go down by the University of Colorado. It's a very liberal, we call it the Republic of Boulder, very liberal town, and just ask 100 people on camera. We had 2 cameras. Ask 100 people 2 questions. The first 50 one question, the second 50 another question. Now, I wish you could feel how liberal and how anti-Christian, not just non-Christian, but anti-Christian this town was. The first 50 people, we asked this question. We said, we're doing a documentary on religion in America, and we'd like to ask you one question. It's interesting. Everybody stopped. When you have cameras out, everybody stops. They think, hey, I'm going to be on camera. And so I was asking the question, excuse me, can we just ask you a question? They're walking by. Yes. We're doing a documentary on religion in America. I have one question. What do you think about Christianity? And I try not to, lead it with, what do you think about Christianity? Or, what do you think about Christianity? I mean, I just tried to ask the question, what do you think about Christianity? Out of 50 people, we asked that question of, what do you think about Christianity? You might guess, because the way I described Boulder, that most people would be negative about it. But how many people do you think were negative about Christianity out of 50? Yell out a number. 46, 30. Okay, we could do this until you got from 1 to 50. rhymes with nifty. Good. Yeah. Somebody up there is really quick. Like 50. Let's see what rhymes with nifty. Yes, 50. It was 50. 50 out of 50. Think of that. Wait. Think of that. 50 out of 50. When I said, "What do you think about Christianity?" 50 were negative, and some people broke out into like swearing and cussing, and one guy flipped off the camera and walked away. We kind of edited that part out. It's funny when you edit things, you still have him doing this, but it's like a little fuzzy thing right there. It's like, I wonder what he was doing there. Was he waving hello? I mean, do you really think when you fuzzy things out that we don't know what's going on? Anyway, so 50 out of 50 didn't like Christianity. And then, then we asked another question. Here's the other question. The second question was another group of people, and actually I called a few of the first 50 back to ask them the second question, but mostly a new group. Hi, we're here doing a documentary on religion in America, and we're just making up the documentary. It actually turned into a little documentary, but at the time we were just trying to ask, we were having an excuse to ask questions, because you have two cameras and people then will stop and answer your question. And we have one question for you. What do you think about Jesus of Nazareth? Now we tried to ask, I didn't say, what do you think about the Lord Jesus Christ? Because that would sound very religious. But the guy's name, by the way, his last name isn't Christ. His first name isn't Lord, and his middle name isn't Jesus. His name is just Jesus. His titles are Lord and Christ. He is the Lord, which means master, and he is the Christ, which means the anointed one, the king, the Messiah. He is those things, but his name is Jesus. We often forget that. We like to call him Christ a lot. In Christian circles, I always hear Jesus called Christ. It's like calling my wife, wife. It could be funny, but after a while, my wife, whose name is Chris, wouldn't like being called wife all the time. Hey, wife, could you get me a wife? That would be weird. That's her title. She is my wife. That's one of her many titles. But calling her that just shows a lack of intimacy. I think calling Jesus Christ all the time or the Lord all the time shows a lack of personal intimacy with Jesus. His name is Jesus. That's his name. It's Jesus, and he was from Nazareth. So people at that time, his name would have been Yeshua, which is a common name. It's like calling somebody Joe or Joshua. Joshua would be the most literal translation into English, Joshua from Yeshua. And so Josh, the son of Joe, the carpenter. And so to qualify it a little bit, he'd be Joshua from Nazareth, Yeshua from Nazareth. So Jesus of Nazareth. So we asked that question. What do you think of Jesus of Nazareth? Just like that, what do you think of Jesus of Nazareth? To 50 people. Actually, 45 were new people and 5 were the same that were angry about the Christianity thing. Out of 50 people, how many people do you think were positive to really like, somewhere in the positive side of liking Jesus? Out of 50, what would you say? 50. Is that the same person that said from nifty to 50? What? Who is that person? Who are you? Who is that man? Who is that man? Wow. Did you cheat? This is actually on my website on a little YouTube video. So you might have, I bet you Googled me before I came, doing your research for chapel, and you knew the answer. It was 50. Seriously, it was 50. Now that's, both surprised me. I didn't think 50 out of 50 would be negative. I would have guessed 40 or 45, to be honest. And I would have guessed 40. I mean, most people are fond of Jesus. Now, the critique there is the 50 people that like Jesus, it's the Jesus that lives in their head. And in Boulder, that's probably a pot-smoking Buddhist Jesus. I mean, honestly, that's, so I'm not saying it's the real, actual biblical Jesus Christ. Is this okay to talk like this, or should I be more, Anna's going, now you know how mom always feels when I talk. Mom's usually in the front row going, "Girl, don't go there, that's too, But seriously, I mean, I'm just saying that Jesus is in the, so when you ask somebody, hey, what do you think of Jesus? They're like, hey, cool. So last night I had about 20 minutes with Chris Stedman, the atheist guy that you had speak here last night. I guess he wasn't here, but wherever, somewhere here at Taylor. I asked him what he thought about Jesus. He goes, oh, Jesus is awesome. So I mean, the Jesus that's in his head, or the Jesus that's in the people's heads in Boulder that they liked, is the Jesus that they've remade and maybe into their own image. I mean, fair enough. I think often the Jesus that we think we're following is also a Jesus that we've remade into our own image. Do you know that if you go to lots of parts of Africa, the pictures of Jesus are black? Don't they know he's white? Oh, wait. He's not from Tulsa, Oklahoma. He actually was blacker than whiter. He was probably dark brown. If you go to China, do you know Jesus has, or Japan, Jesus has slanty eyes. Jesus looks like the people that, and I think part of that's fair enough. I mean, for us to kind of think that Jesus is a white American Jesus, partially is okay because he does contextualize himself into our context, but he's not white, he's not American, and he didn't grow up Christian. Now, he's Jesus the Christ, the biblical Jesus Christ. I don't want you to be too alarmed yet. It gets worse, just a minute here. So, let me go to the Middle East real quick, and then I'm going to finish at Harvard. For some reason, this is really funny. My iPad, it chooses its own words. So I wrote in Harvard, just to remind myself, and the word now is Kyung. Kyung. How did Harvard get to Kyung? I wonder if God's trying to tell me something. I don't think so. Okay, so back to the Middle East for a little bit. We lived there for 12 years in Beirut, and we did things in the parliament and stuff in Lebanon. We lead little groups, we call them Jesus groups, around parliaments in the Middle East. And so I was meeting with a member of parliament in Lebanon. His name is Mispah, and he doesn't mind. He actually knows I tell this story. It's a great story. It's an easy story to tell. And so I was at his house. It was the first time I ever met this guy. He's a member of parliament. He's in the Foreign Relations Committee in Lebanon. And I went to the parliament to meet him. He actually forgot we had a meeting, and he was going home for lunch. And so when he saw me, he was like, I said, Carl. Like, Carl, yes, come to lunch with me. So I jumped in the back of his Mercedes, and his driver drove us off to the point of Beirut, which is a Mediterranean city. And we sat down on his balcony overlooking the sea and roughing it for the sake of the gospel. And so we're sitting out there, and he shoos away all of his, his staff, and it's just he and I. And we have these 2 little cups of Arabic coffee poured in front of us, and he just kind of sits down and he sighs. And I said, how's it going? I don't know really what to ask a member of parliament, but I kind of said something stupid like, how's it going in parliament, And he goes, oh, not good. I've lost all hope. And now he's a Muslim, but he later defined himself as an atheist Muslim. It's interesting, you can actually be from any background, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, whatever, and then choose for whatever variety of reasons, usually because you haven't seen any reality of God in your life. You can choose to be an atheist. And so he was a Muslim background atheist because he'd never really actually seen God work. And so he said he had no hope in parliament. I said, that's not good. You're in charge of the country. You don't have any hope? He's like, yeah, I know that's not good. But he goes, now what do you do? And I said, actually, I'm a hope broker. And he goes, oh, a what? I'd actually never said that before, but it just kind of came out. He goes, he said, where do you get your hope? And I go, oh, it's a long story. It's not that interesting. And then he goes, what? And then I said, by the way, I think we're too quick to give answers. Did you ever notice the guy, the one that we're following, didn't do that? He actually never answered anybody. I mean, the question that they asked him, he didn't answer them. He'd answer a different question that he just made up the answer to a question they didn't ask. He is God after all, so he can do that. But he never answered the questions directly. And it's funny, in our apologetic approach to Western evangelism, we're taught to always be ready to answer anybody that has any question. We misquote 1 Peter 3 that says, be ready to give an answer to the hope that's in you. We misquote it to say, anytime anybody asks you any difficult question about the universe or the Trinity or suffering of mankind, be ready to answer a question like C.S. Lewis did. And Jesus didn't do that. He didn't do that. What did he do? He hung out with sinners. He was accused of being a friend of sinners and a wine bibber. So he was bibbing wine with sinners. Now, does that offend you? I don't know. Jesus did that. That's what Jesus was accused of, rightly so. He was accused of hanging out with prostitutes and sometimes even Pharisees on the other side, and lepers and touching lepers and demoniacs, and being friends of the worst of tax collectors, of traitors, of people of treason. He was accused of that because that's what he did. So this guy, when I said hope broker, he's like, well, where do you get your hope? I said, let's get back to that. And so I asked him some more questions, and he said, no, seriously, what do you do? I said, well, actually, okay, here's what, after about a half hour, I finally answered. I said, we have little groups around the country, of small groups of young people, of kids, of poor people, poor Palestinian refugees that live in UN refugee camps, all these different groups. And then we go through a bunch of principles of a great leader. He goes, well, who is it? I go, oh, it doesn't really matter. It's just a leader that everybody agrees on, that everybody's attracted to, the most amazing leader of all time. But, I mean, you would know. And he goes, Mother Teresa? That's what he said. He goes, Mother Teresa. I go, no, but that's a good one. I actually like Mother Teresa. That'd be great. He's like, well, then who is it? I said, somebody before Mother Teresa. He's like, why don't you just tell me who it is? I said, well, it's more fun if you guess. He goes, okay, well, he goes, oh, I know. I'll bet I know who it is. It's Gandhi. And I go, well, you just named 2 of my favorite 3 leaders from the past. He goes, well, who's the third? I said, well, you have to guess. I said, I'll give you a hint. Those 2 people that you named, Gandhi and Mother Teresa, got a lot of their stuff from this person. He's like, really? Huh. So he's like scrolling back through history, and he's actually muttering names out loud. And then he goes, I've got it. Now remember, he's a Muslim, Sunni Muslim, member of parliament, atheist. He hits the table so hard our coffee cups both spilled over. He goes, I know, it's Jesus. It's Jesus. And I went like this. I go, yeah. It's Jesus. He goes, no, don't just go, oh, yeah, it's Jesus. That's definitely Jesus, right? It's definitely Jesus. Now, don't you know, educational principle 101 is it's so much better if the person gets the answer than if you tell them. You know, people are sick of us telling them what to believe. Have you noticed that? Have you noticed, actually, practically, do you think, does it work well when we tell people that they should believe in Jesus? Like, you need to believe in Jesus or else, and kind of a little bit of a wag of the finger. I mean, you guys don't do that, but proverbial wag of the finger, does that work well? And again, Jesus was so much more careful. Now, he wasn't careful with religious leaders. He was hard on them, but with the sinners, the outsiders, he was very nuanced. He was very inviting. He invited people into his presence. He didn't preach at them. The crowds followed him. People loved him. They tried to make him king by force because they were attracted to Jesus. Partly because he fed them bread and fish and he healed all their sick people. So that's part of it. But also he said things that were profound and confusing and made them, wow. And we have so dumbed down Jesus into this simple little caricature that's a white Christian from Oklahoma. Sorry to pick on Oklahoma. I don't know why I'm doing that this morning. Or let's say Texas. I'm from Colorado, so we like to pick on Texas. He's not from Texas. It's like, yeah, he is from Texas. He's from Texas. No, he's not from Dallas either. And so let's see, he's not from Abilene. Nobody from Abilene, okay. So, anyway, when we did that, actually, you know what this member of parliament did at the end of our time talking about Jesus? He invited me to start one of these Jesus groups in the parliament. And then we did. And then the Hezbollah leaders started to come. And then the Hezbollah asked us if we'd start speaking. I actually ended up preaching in a mosque around Lebanon, preaching Christ, not the religion of Christianity. People in the other parts of the world think the religion of Christianity is tied to America, and America and Christianity are inseparable, and they get confused between the two. When you preach Christianity, not Christ, it confuses people. When you preach Christ, it sometimes confuses people, but more often draws them. Last story real quick, if I can do this in 2 minutes, I wonder if I can. Harvard. So I speak at Harvard every year. I speak at the Kennedy School of Government there, and I did a thing for about 700 people one night, and we rented the Harvard Library the next day and had meetings at the top of the hour. Do I have 2 more minutes? Till 42, 45, 50? Top of the hour? How far can I go? How much can I mess up classes today? No, okay, I'll do this real quick. So this lady comes in, these two ladies come in, they're meeting with me after I spoke at Harvard the night before. One of them is a PhD, she's actually a postdoctoral. I thought you could stop studying once you get your doctorate, but evidently not. So she's doing postdoctoral studies at Harvard. She's a psychologist. And she walks in, she announces, I'm Jewish, I'm an atheist, and I don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. That's what she said when she walked in the room to meet with me. And I go, great, my name's Carl. And she goes, well, I'm Maggie, but what do you think about that? I go, great. I mean, I don't mind if you're a Jewish atheist, but I mean, do whatever you want, be whatever you want. She's like, well, aren't you going to try to convince me Jesus is the Messiah? I said, no. And she goes, well, what are you doing here then? I go, I'm just sitting here drinking Dunkin' Donuts coffee and having a donut. I mean, what are you doing here? She goes, well, she told me that you are a Christian evangelist. I go, oh my, no. She goes, well, then what are you? I go, I don't know, I'm just a guy named Carl. I'm so confused by this conversation. She goes, well, this is the dumbest conversation I've ever had. I go, yeah, it's pretty dumb. I don't know what's going on. And then she's like, and I go, well, how about if you sit down? So she finally sits down, and then she crosses her arm like this. She goes, well, if you're going to have a best shot to convince me that Jesus is the Messiah, what would it be? I go, actually, I don't have a best shot, and I don't do that. I actually don't do apologetics. And I actually don't care what you believe. You can believe whatever you want. She goes, well, I mean, how are you going to make me a Christian if you don't even know how to do it? I go, well, I'm not trying to make you a Christian, so I don't have anything that I have to do. She's like, well, if you were going to give me a best shot about Jesus being the Messiah, what would it be? I go, I honestly don't have one. I guess I'd say he likes you. She goes, that's stupid. And I go, see, that was my best shot, and that wasn't any good. She goes, well, that's just the dumbest thing I've ever. And then she just burst out into tears, and she just started wailing and sobbing. And then for 3 minutes, and then she's blowing her nose, and then she goes, I still don't believe he's the Messiah. And I said, and I'm still not trying to convince you. And she goes, well, what was that? I go, I have no idea what that was. And then she's like, well, that was something. I go, well, it seemed like it was something, but I don't know what it was, and I didn't do it to you. I'm just sitting here. And she was like, well, this is the strangest. And then my friend, who's just like beside himself, he's a professor there at Harvard, he's like, we have a Bible study on Saturday morning. And she goes, then she dried up like that. She folded her arms. She goes, I'm Jewish. I'm not coming to a Bible study. Because then she felt like we were trying to convert her out of her people into another group of people. And I said, how about this, Maggie? How about if you study an original document by an original source who is Jewish about a Jewish Jesus? I said, remember, Jesus was Jewish. This guy's got his name Matthew, an original document. I said, do you have any Matthew documents? And the guy was like, uh-huh. I said, would you like to study the original document of one of the early followers of Jesus? Jewish Jesus, Jewish Matthew, everything's Jewish, just like you. She's like, okay. And 2 years later, she gave her life to Jesus. Guys, I know you know this, but as I pray for you, I want to remind you, it's Jesus. It's not a religion, not even ours. It's not a system. It's not doctrines. I love good doctrine. You're all theologians, by the way. Be good theologians. But theology and doctrine is not enough. It's an actual living relationship with a real live person, and his name is Jesus. So, Father, I pray in your name, Jesus, that you would re-encourage, reinvigorate, other words that I can't think of right now, these great people this morning. I just pray that their hearts would burn inside of them, that they would remember the passion that they first had maybe they've lost, maybe they never had it, of following you, and how exciting it is, how much adventure, how much fun, how crazy it is, how on the edge it is to live a life of following you, Jesus. We love you. We think you're awesome. You're our best friend. In your name we pray. Amen.